Our platform is crafted by Democrats, but it is not about partisanship, it's about pragmatism.
Pragmatic or progressive? We examine what defines the Democratic Party. You're watching Inside Story, US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ritansi. For Republicans, the Democrats are the party of big government, working to divide the United States through class warfare.
After 4 years of government trying to divide up the wealth, we will get America creating wealth again. The choice is whether to put hard limits on economic growth or hard limits on the size of government. And we choose to limit government.
But the Democrats argue they're the party that will rebuild the American economy and the American dream from the bottom up.
It's a choice between a country where the middle class pays more so the millionaires can pay less, or a country where everybody pays their fair share so we can reduce the deficit and create the jobs of the future. It's a choice between a nation that slashes funding for our schools and guts Pell Grants, or a nation that invests more in education. And it's a choice between a politician who rewards companies that ship American jobs overseas, or a leader who brings jobs back home.
Critics from the left, however, say that aside from a few social issues, the two parties are barely distinguishable. Al Jazeera's Patty Culhane has more from Charlotte, North Carolina, on what the Democrats are focusing on at their national convention.
Here at the Democratic National Convention, the Democratic Party is trying to focus the country on social issues and the difference between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to things like women's rights. They talked a lot about the president signing the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which made it easier for women to sue for equal pay. They're talking a lot about reproductive rights, whether or not a woman should be allowed to choose whether or not to have an abortion. They think that is a defining issue for the Democrats. They're also talking a lot about gay rights. As you know, the president got rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military, came out late in his first term saying that he supports gay marriage. They think those key groups are going to propel them to a second time in the White House, could help them win the majority of the Congress, so they're really focusing on those groups here at the convention. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Charlotte, North Carolina.
So who exactly are the Democrats? To discuss this, we're joined from Charlotte, North Carolina by Gary Younge, columnist for The Guardian America. From Salt Lake City, Utah, we have Justice Party presidential candidate Rocky Anderson. And here in the studio, we're joined by historian Michael Kazin. Professor Kazin, I mean, let's face it, there is a sense that one of the reasons why the Democrats are focusing so much on social issues is that's the main distinction they have from the mainstream of the Republican Party. In the end, they're just neoliberals with guilt.
I don't think that's right, actually. I think the Democratic Party at base is still a liberal party in economics. Obviously, they disagree fundamentally about what kind of health care plan America should have. They disagree about whether there should be more regulation of corporations or not. They disagree about whether labor unions should have the right to collective bargaining. So clearly, we don't have a far left party and a far right party, but we do have important differences beyond the social issues.
Rocky Anderson, I mean, those differences we do hear, certainly rhetorically, on the platform and the convention floor. But I mean, is it mainly rhetoric? Is there some disconnect, do you think?
There's a huge disconnect. This is a matter of having a far-right party and a right-of-center party nowadays. There's not even a centrist party, let alone a left-of-center party, major party. We see in the area of climate change, for instance, a massive difference just in the last 4 years in the party's platform. Energy sources, they're going from a commitment to clean, renewable energy sources and the language in the present platform is an all of the above approach, including more oil and gas exploration and even a commitment to so-called clean coal, something that President Obama talked about when he accepted his party's nomination 4 years ago, and there still is nothing such as clean coal, and if we depend on burning coal, the game is over in terms of climate change. Civil and human rights, the economy, the slaving approach toward Wall Street, caving in at every turn, even no discussion about breaking up banks too big to fail, getting back to Glass-Steagall, which, by the way, was repealed under a Democratic administration.
All right, well, let's take a closer look at what the Democratic National Platform is. It was just approved on Tuesday. On taxes, it calls for an extension of the middle-class tax cuts for the 98% of families who make less than $250,000 a year. On healthcare, it trumpets the passing of the Affordable Healthcare Law, which the Republicans want to repeal. The platform says the party unequivocally supports Roe versus Wade, the decision that made abortion legal. The Republicans say they oppose abortion. For the first time, the platform supports same-sex marriage. The platform states that Democrats are strongly committed to comprehensive immigration reform, something President Obama failed to implement in his first term. In terms of foreign policy, the platform calls for a, quote, responsible end to the war in Afghanistan, but like President Obama, the party is vague on specifics. It suggests support for a further reduction in the US's nuclear weapons stockpile and does not rule out cuts to the military budget. The document mentions the middle class 44 times, although only makes reference to the poor on 3 occasions. Gary Younge, do you think that's enough to distinguish the Democratic Party as a principled force that is substantially different to the Republican Party?
Well, I think there is a difference. I think the difference is incremental and insufficient, but I do think there is a difference. I was in Tampa last week, and certainly if you think of abortion, gay rights, but also some economic policies, I don't think it is just social policies, then there really is there is a difference. It's just that it's relatively small given the differences that Americans want, which I think is why, with both parties, what you've seen is a more in sorrow than in anger approach. Obama is a good man, but he's a bad president. Romney's a good man, but he's a bad candidate, because actually neither of the parties are particularly popular right now. And Americans in general are very disaffected with their political class and their political culture, because they don't seem to be able to, or it doesn't seem to be able to solve the problems at hand. The debt, the economy, creating jobs. I don't think most people believe that either party really has a solution to those.
But as part of that problem, I guess we're trying to find out the core principles governing, for example, even that Democratic national platform. In fact, let's hear a bit more from New Jersey Mayor Cory Booker. He was attempting to discuss what motivated the platform that we just read out.
Our platform is crafted by Democrats, but it is not about partisanship. It's about pragmatism. It's not about left or right, but about moving America and our economy forward.
And then shortly after saying that, his first specific mention of what was on the platform was this.
Our platform calls for significant cuts in federal spending. Our platform calls for a balanced deficit reduction plan where everyone, from elected officials to the wealthy and the super wealthy, pay their fair share.
Professor, I mean, that's all very well. You know, people should pay their fair share. I think even people on the moderate wing of the Republican Party agree with that. However, the first point he wanted to specify was we're calling for significant cuts in federal spending, which, again, even people perhaps on the center-right suggest isn't a great idea in a downturn, and is, in fact, very much the right-wing orthodoxy, a very much principled point of the right wing, the far right wing.
Well, you know, for a large political party, the Democrats are a party which is not primarily united around ideology, but around leanings, you might say, towards certain policies as opposed to conservative policies. You know, this is obviously poll-driven. Americans are schizoid about what they want from government. They want government to do less, except when it's helping them. Then they want it to do more. They want the rich to pay more, but they don't like the idea of taxes either. So Booker's trying to square the circle, so to speak. And he's, of course, known as one of the more sort of, pragmatic, less ideological figures in the party, as opposed to a more liberal figure like Elizabeth Warren, who's speaking tonight, for example, who clearly wouldn't give that same speech.
But Rocky Anderson, was that the Democrat Party that you were a member of then? One which didn't necessarily have any core principles, but simply had leanings, if not ideology?
Not at all. And you notice that Cory Booker talked about this not being about partisanship, but about pragmatism. Well, not to add to the alliteration here, but it is a party that is completely without principle now. This president promised 4 years ago that he would end the Bush tax cuts. 4 years later, they're still in place. The very wealthy are not paying their fair share.
Congress,
when
too.
So many people are going without, and there are massive disparities in wealth and income between the very wealthy and the rest of the people in this country. Greater disparities than at any time since the 1920s. This was brought to us by a combination of the Republican and Democratic parties. And they're both feeding at the same trough of special interest money, and they have both turned this government into a plutocracy, betraying the public interest.
Gary Younge, was Cory Booker right there in the end there? This isn't about left and right. Is that perhaps why we're struggling to find these principles?
Well, I mean, where I would either disagree or have a kind of slightly different view from Rocky is I think that's kind of always been the case. There's never been a socialist party or even a social democratic party in America. There's always been special interests involved. There's always been a lot of money sloshing around. And I think that the difference, if there was, if not principle, then a logic here in Charlotte with the Democrats, it's this, that inequality of outcome is acceptable if there is equality of opportunity. So, which is not something that you would hear a European Social Democrat say, but when you think of Cory Booker talking about government reduction and cutting government spending, that's not massively different to the British Labour Party or the German Social Democrats or most of those centre-left parties who all say, well,
that's quite a recent phenomenon they're here. I mean, they're there rather, as opposed to here, right? I mean,
it's a recent phenomenon
in Europe.
Well, if you look at the Blair government, or
right.
if you look at Schroeder's government in Germany before he was kicked out, Schroeder implemented a whole
right, but the third way then, exactly.
Relaxing labour laws. Well, that's relatively recent insofar as it's been around for about 15 or 20 years. But Clinton was a triangulator. I think that the trajectory is quite similar. What I think is different is that American political culture started off in a different place. It started off to the right of Europe and the rest of the world, and it's ended up to the right of Europe and the rest of the world. But to say there's no principle would be to say that I think the platform on gay marriage, the platform on abortion, that those things actually don't matter. I think that they do matter. I don't think they are sufficient for what American people want right now. And the central thing that they want is the economy fixed, and neither party actually has a plan for that.
Rocky Anderson?
But this is how absolutely cynical and unprincipled this party has become. They utter the right words, like President Obama saying that he personally favors marriage equality. Now that he's played politics with it and he's in the middle of an election, having said for years that his thinking on this issue is evolving, but he still won't stand for federal protection for marriage equality for gays and lesbians. He's happy to take the millions of dollars that flow to him after saying the right thing, but he won't take a stand for federal protections. Would he do the same thing in terms of equal protection on account of race or religion? No, he says he's going to leave it up to the states when it comes to marriage equality. He's done the same thing. It is so cynical with respect to immigration. He's almost 4 years through his term. His administration deported more people, and especially Latinos, than any other 4 years in the history of this nation. And then he turns around at the last minute and says, oh, he's going to show this compassion toward young immigrant children. Well, I think that's great, but he's doing it solely to get the votes. Look what he did on medical marijuana. Promised 4 years ago, no federal resources spent on medical marijuana, where states have legalized it. Then he turns around, keeps in Bush's DEA head, and they're prosecuting with a vengeance.
And in fact uses an icon of stoner culture to actually represent him to the youth electorate. But Professor, even on outsourcing, gets lots of applause on the hall in the hall. And yet he's pushing through, on the Democratic Party especially, pushing through free trade agreements which clearly are going to help outsourcing and so forth. This goes on.
There's a basic misapprehension here that Rocky is captive to, I'm afraid, and maybe some other people on the far left in American politics are, that somehow the president, any president, is like a king, is like a monarch, and whatever he wants to do, he can do. And we have a Congress, which, as you know, today the House is run by very conservative Republicans. It could be that both houses will be at the end of this election, and without 60 solid votes in the Senate, of course, Obama could get anything important passed, and therefore, I think we have to remember that Obama is a politician in a country which still is more conservative than liberals.
But wouldn't a principled politician at least push a bit harder if you only have leanings? And arguably, I guess, Bill Clinton has been mentioned. I mean, this particularly came about with Bill Clinton and his triangulation, I suppose. I mean, that's one of the reasons. I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy then that you don't get things
I think in the
done,
first 2 years, he pushed as hard as he could have pushed on health care, on the stimulus, which Republicans have been attacking for not creating jobs, when in fact it did create jobs, though not as many as you should have. He talked about immigration reform, but clearly the votes were not there. And in a period where he knew he had 2 years to accomplish a lot, he couldn't do everything. So I'm not saying Obama's been perfect. I'm not saying he's the politician I'd like him to be, or that people, liberals and radicals, would like him to be. But I think it's wrong to believe that somehow he's cynical. I think he's done, if he had the supermajority the way Franklin Roosevelt had in the 1930s, the way Lyndon Johnson had in the middle of the 60s, he could have accomplished.
We're going to lose Gary on the satellite in about 2 minutes. So I just want to get a last word from him. Clearly, Obama's not a king. However, it has to be remembered that the progressive caucus of the Democrat Party is the largest caucus in the Democrat Party, and President Obama completely ignores them when they come up with a budget that's very different to Paul Ryan's, for example.
Well, I mean, that's true, and I find myself in between Dr. Kazin and Rocky. He's not a king. Dr. Kazin's right about that, and he has to work within the parameters of American politics and American political culture. That said, he could have said that he supported gay marriage at any time. He chose a few months before the election. He could have had his decree about Latino youth at any time. He chose to do it before the election, and to some extent, presidents do lead by example. And I don't think he did push as hard as he might have on stimulus. I don't think he did push as hard as he might have on healthcare reform. And so I think there could have been more leadership. What he couldn't do is magic a new country where kind of social democratic ideas are kind of come with the mother's milk. That's just not possible.
Gary, we're going to develop some of those ideas, but I think we're losing you on the satellite now. But thank you very much for your contribution for the moment. Rocky Anderson, is there some mythology to that, though, when we say he couldn't do it? I mean, I repeat, the progressive caucus of the Democratic Party is the largest caucus in the Democratic Party. The polls seem to suggest that the people are in favor of more redistribution or a public option on healthcare and so forth. So it gets a bit confusing.
Absolutely. And when President Obama had a Democratic majority, they did nothing to reform the Patriot Act. He walked away from any concept of the rule of law when he said about enforcing our federal laws against war criminals, against those who engaged in illegal surveillance on American citizens' communications. Let's just forget about it, because these are the rich and the powerful. There are very different rules for them, as well as for those who committed massive financial fraud on Wall Street. This is what an administration does. They're responsible for upholding the law and prosecuting those who violate it. And with a Democratic majority in Congress, he has no excuses. If Obama had been president instead of FDR, we wouldn't have seen the Glass-Steagall Act. We wouldn't have seen a WPA jobs program. We wouldn't have seen a Social Security program, because they're two completely different kinds
Professor
of
Kazin,
leaders.
I mean, when
President Obama has folded.
When we try to understand why that might be the case, when we see people on the conference floor wildly cheering as members of the Democratic Party, various positions that President Obama and the leadership really have no intention of carrying out because they say they're not king. I mean, is it simply that they think they're not king, or do they simply not? Does the leadership of the Democratic Party, the Democratic National Council and so forth, the leadership committee, do they have fundamentally different priorities to the rank and file
I don't think
Democratic Party?
there's a split. I mean, Barack Obama said that if he could start the healthcare system all over again, he would start with a single-payer system. But because we have this entrenched interests, he has to he had to negotiate with them, he felt, the insurance companies, and compromise with them. And I think, you know, there's, as always, in these mass, primarily non-ideological parties, the Republican Party has become much more ideological in recent years, but historically they were not all that ideological. There's a battle for what some would call the soul of the party, but really a battle for what policies are going to be stressed. There's also, obviously, in a capitalist society like this, where and in the crazy finance system we have for campaigns, you have to raise money from some rich people. But you know, to Rocky's point, if Obama's only a corporate candidate, if the Democratic Party is completely beholden to corporate interests, why are 95% of all the people on Wall Street given to Mitt Romney this year, and rather than Obama, which more of them did 4 years ago?
But Rocky,
4 years ago, yes. Yeah, 4 years ago, President Obama received record amounts of money from
But he's
Wall
not
Street,
now. Why
over
not?
$1 million from Goldman Sachs alone.
Yeah.
And then he surrounded himself with all these, because I think they've used him up. They've gotten exactly what they wanted. That there are still banks too large to fail. He never talks about breaking up those banks. He never talks about bringing back the restrictions of Glass-Steagall or having the reserve requirements. All of these things that would have prevented the economic meltdown in 2008 and that are still setting us up for another economic disaster. He still is not looking out for the American people. We have a poverty rate in this country that is higher than it was in 1965 before the war on poverty. But Rocky,
it's like all of the gains of the Great Society have disappeared.
But Rocky, do you think it's simply a leadership of the Democrat Party and President Obama who is simply bumbling away and being used? Or is it more than that? Is there an ideological belief since Clinton that perhaps that some of the orthodoxies of the right wing do make more sense? There is belief. It's not just bumbling around and being used.
No, I don't think it's a matter of ideology at all. I think it's exactly what we heard earlier. It's a matter of, in their view, pragmatism, winning races. Having a president that's wearing your letter, a D on his jersey, is more important to so many people now than principle, the kind of principle to which the Democratic Party used to subscribe. That's why I left the party. I was a member of that party for a very good reason. Those reasons are gone now. And look, I mean, we have a president that's targeting U.S. citizens for assassination without due process. We have a president who signs off on the NDAA to allow our government to round up anybody, including U.S. citizens, without charges, without trial, without legal assistance, without the right of habeas corpus. This is the most anti-American subversive legislation ever passed by a bipartisan Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, this political duopoly that have such a stranglehold on our democracy and signed into law by this president. And that seems to be okay with Democrats as long as he's a Democrat. They would be out raising holy hell in the streets today if that were a Republican president.
And actually, as we speak, I'm hearing that the Democratic National Committee has now restored mention of Jerusalem, I think, as the capital of Israel. There was some uproar, apparently, in some quarters about that. Again, it's about principle, about sticking to what you believe in, I suppose. Is there a point, Professor Kazin, and clearly, you know, we made it clear that the Democrats were never necessarily about principle. Is there a point, though, where historically you say, hang on, this Democratic Party is going much further than most in surrendering principle in order to retain power and be pragmatic, especially when you hear some of the policies that Rocky Anderson was just discussing and the constitutionality about some of some of those policies. This is something out of the ordinary. It's not simply a matter of the Democratic Party doing its usual pragmatic thing as the Republican does its.
Well, I think there would be a point, but I think we're not anywhere near that point today. I mean, it's not a surprise, perhaps. I mean, Rocky's saying doesn't go very well with the idea that Republicans and conservatives think that Barack Obama's a socialist, that he's gone way. He's so principled that he's not even a good
right, but what difference should that make if some of those policies have not only public opinion behind them, but actually, supposedly, you know, the historical democratic precedent behind
but
it
as I
well.
said before, I think within unfortunate limits, from my point of view and from the point of view of both Rocky and Gary, the Democratic Party is following principle. It's following principle on defending labor unions, which is not popular among hardly any employers in the country. Yes, yes. The people who Obama nominated to the National Labor Relations Board, for example, some are friends of mine, they're union lawyers, and they were not confirmed by the Republican Senate because they knew they were going to give labor unions a fair shake.
I have to stop you there, Professor Kazin. Thank you very much. Our thanks to Rocky Anderson and Gary Younge. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.